My name is Elnora, and I'm 62 years old. I've spent most of my life believing that love and sacrifice would always be rewarded with respect and gratitude. I raised my son Marcus alone after my husband passed away when the boy was just 8. I worked 3 jobs, scrubbed floors until my hands bled, and gave up everything so my child could have a better life than mine. Marcus graduated college, got a great job, married a beautiful woman, and moved into a mansion. I thought I had finally earned my place at his table. But at his 30th birthday party, I discovered a chair reserved for me with a nameplate that read, Elnora, Trash. Before I share what happened next, where are you watching from today? Please let me know in the comments and hit that like button if you've ever felt undervalued by the people you love most. Now let me take you back to where this story really begins. The journey started 24 years ago when my world collapsed. Robert, my husband of 15 years, was driving home from his construction job on a rainy November evening. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit him head-on. The doctor said he died instantly, but I felt like I died a little that day too. Marcus was only 8 years old, sitting at our kitchen table doing homework when the police knocked on our door. I had to tell my baby boy that Daddy wasn't coming home anymore. The insurance money helped with funeral costs, but it wasn't enough to keep us comfortable. I had been a stay-at-home mom since Marcus was born, so I had no recent work experience. But I knew I had to figure something out fast. Within 2 weeks, I found my first job cleaning office buildings downtown from midnight to 6 in the morning. The pay was minimum wage, but it meant I could be home when Marcus got off the school bus. My hands weren't used to the harsh cleaning chemicals. By the end of my first month, my palms were cracked and bleeding. I wore rubber gloves, but the industrial-strength bleach still found ways to burn my skin. Some nights, I'd come home and soak my hands in ice water just to stop the stinging. But when Marcus would wake up for school and find me making his breakfast like nothing had happened, the pain felt worth it. Weekends meant my second job. I started a small baking business from our kitchen making birthday cakes and cookies for neighbors. Word spread, and soon I was getting orders from across town. I'd stay up until 3 in the morning decorating cakes, then catch a few hours of sleep before starting again. Marcus would sometimes wake up and find me covered in flour, and I'd joke that I was practicing to be a professional baker someday. When Marcus turned 14, I took on a third job at the local grocery store. I worked there every afternoon from 2 to 8 stocking shelves and running the register. It meant less time helping with homework, but Marcus was smart enough to handle it on his own. He started taking the bus to the store after school and doing his homework in the break room while I finished my shift. I remember the day Marcus brought home his first report card with straight A's. I was so tired I could barely keep my eyes open, but seeing those grades made every sacrifice feel justified. That night, I told him he could become anything he wanted to be. A doctor, a lawyer, maybe even the president. He laughed and said he just wanted to make me proud. I held him tight and told him he already had. By the time Marcus was a senior in high school, I had managed to save enough money for his college applications. He applied to 15 schools, and I drove him to every campus visit, even though it meant using vacation days from all 3 jobs. When the acceptance letters started arriving, I cried harder than I had since Robert's funeral. My boy had earned a full scholarship to the State University's business program. The night before Marcus left for college, we sat on our front porch eating ice cream from the container. He thanked me for everything I'd done, promising he'd make all my sacrifices worthwhile. He said someday he'd buy me a big house with a garden and I'd never have to work again. I believed every word because that's what mothers do. We believe in our children's promises even when we should know better. Marcus excelled in college just like I knew he would. He called every Sunday during his freshman year telling me about his classes and new friends. I continued working my 3 jobs, sending him care packages and a little spending money whenever I could manage it. When he made the dean's list that first semester, I was so proud, I told every customer at the grocery store. During his sophomore year, Marcus started talking about internships at big companies in the city. He said he wanted to work in finance, making the kind of money that could change our family's situation forever. I encouraged him completely, even though it meant he'd probably move far away after graduation. A mother's job is to raise her children to fly, even when it breaks her heart to watch them leave the nest. It was during his junior year that Marcus met Stephanie. She was in his advanced economics class, the daughter of a prominent businessman who owned several car dealerships across the state. Marcus was completely smitten from the moment he mentioned her name. When he brought her home for spring break, I could immediately see why. Stephanie was beautiful, well-spoken, and carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. But there was something in her eyes when she looked at our modest home that made me uncomfortable. She smiled politely when I served dinner on our everyday plates, but I caught her glancing around our small living room with barely concealed judgment. When I asked about her family, she mentioned their country club memberships and family vacations to Europe like they were just normal parts of life. That first visit, I tried my best to make Stephanie feel welcome. I cooked Marcus's favorite meals and shared embarrassing stories from his childhood, hoping to connect with this girl who had captured my son's heart. But every attempt at conversation felt forced. When I mentioned working at the grocery store, she seemed genuinely shocked that people actually did such jobs. She recovered quickly with a polite, "Oh, that must be interesting. But the damage was done." After they left to go back to school, I noticed Marcus's phone calls became shorter and less frequent. When I asked about Stephanie, he'd give brief answers and change the subject. I told myself he was just busy with school and his new relationship. Young love has a way of making everything else seem less important, even family. During his senior year, Marcus landed an internship at a prestigious investment firm in the state capital. He was making more money in 3 months than I made in a year at any of my jobs. When he graduated summa cum laude, I used my vacation time and savings to attend the ceremony. Stephanie's parents were there too, dressed in expensive clothes and taking professional photos. I felt underdressed in my one nice dress, but I was still the proudest mother in that auditorium. The company offered Marcus a full-time position immediately after graduation. He called to tell me the news, and for the first time in months, he sounded like my little boy again. He said he'd finally be able to take care of me like he'd always promised. I started imagining a future where I could quit at least one of my jobs, maybe even all 3 eventually. After 18 years of struggle, it felt like we'd finally made it. Marcus's transformation began almost immediately after he started his new job. When he came home for his first visit, I barely recognized the young man walking up our front steps. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than I made in 2 months, and he'd traded his old reliable Honda for a luxury sedan with leather seats and a navigation system. The changes weren't just external. Marcus spoke differently now, using business terms and dropping names of important clients like we were supposed to be impressed. When I served dinner, he mentioned that his favorite restaurant downtown had just received a James Beard nomination. I had no idea what that meant, but I smiled and nodded like I did. 3 months later, Marcus called to tell me he and Stephanie were getting serious. They'd moved in together in a downtown apartment that cost more per month than I'd ever made in 3. He invited me for dinner, and I spent days preparing, buying a new blouse and getting my hair done for the first time in years. The apartment was stunning, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Stephanie greeted me at the door wearing a dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She gave me a brief hug and complimented my vintage blouse in a way that made me wonder if she was being kind or condescending. During dinner, I tried to ask about their jobs and future plans, but the conversation felt stilted. Stephanie would answer questions with polite but minimal responses, then turn to Marcus to discuss people and places I'd never heard of. I felt like an outsider at my own son's table, listening to conversations about wine tastings and weekend trips to ski resorts. When I mentioned that I'd finally been promoted to assistant manager at the grocery store, there was an uncomfortable silence. Marcus quickly changed the subject to ask about my drive into the city, as if my job was something embarrassing that needed to be glossed over. That night, I drove home wondering when my son had become ashamed of the woman who'd sacrificed everything for his success. The invitations became less frequent after that. Marcus would call every few weeks with updates about work promotions and social events, but he stopped asking me to visit. When I suggested coming for dinner, there was always some excuse. They were traveling for work, or Stephanie's parents were visiting, or they had some important business function to attend. 6 months later, Marcus called with news that should have been joyful. He and Stephanie were engaged, and they were planning a spring wedding. But instead of excitement in his voice, I heard something that sounded almost like an apology. When I asked about helping with wedding planning, he said Stephanie's mother had already hired a professional coordinator. When I offered to make the groom's cake, he said they'd already contracted with an award-winning bakery. I hung up that night feeling like I'd lost my son to a world where mothers like me simply didn't fit. The boy who used to help me count quarters for grocery money was now engaged to a woman whose family probably spent more on flowers than I made in a year. I told myself that love finds a way to bridge any gap, but deep down, I was starting to worry about where I'd fit in Marcus's new life. The wedding took place at the Stephanie's family's country club on a perfect Saturday in May. I'd saved for months to buy an appropriate dress and shoes, spending more on one outfit than I usually spent on clothes in an entire year. When I arrived, I was directed to my assigned seat at table 12, which was located in the far back corner of the reception hall, partially hidden behind a decorative column. Table 12 was filled with distant relatives and family friends who didn't quite make the cut for the premium seating. I introduced myself as the groom's mother, and most people seemed genuinely surprised. One elderly woman asked if I was Marcus's stepmother, apparently unable to believe that the successful young man marrying into the prestigious Hartwell family came from such humble beginnings. Meanwhile, Stephanie's parents were seated at the head table with the wedding party receiving congratulations and posing for photos with every important guest. Her father gave a lengthy toast about welcoming Marcus into their family and how proud they were of his accomplishments. He mentioned Marcus's business degree and his promising career, but somehow managed to avoid any reference to how he'd achieved those things or who had sacrificed to make them possible. When it was time for Marcus to speak, I held my breath, hoping he'd acknowledge the woman who'd raised him. Instead, he gave a generic speech, thanking everyone who had supported him along the way, without mentioning anyone specifically. He talked about looking forward to his future with Stephanie and how grateful he was to be joining such a wonderful family. I applauded with everyone else, but my heart was breaking with each word. After the ceremony, I tried to approach Marcus for a private moment, but he was constantly surrounded by Stephanie's family friends and business associates. When I finally managed to catch his attention, he gave me a quick hug and said we'd catch up later. Later never came. I spent most of the reception watching my son from across the room, feeling like a stranger at my own child's wedding. The newlyweds left for a 2-week honeymoon in Italy, a gift from Stephanie's parents. When they returned, they moved directly into a beautiful house in Stephanie's family's exclusive neighborhood. The house was a wedding gift complete with a garden swimming pool and 3-car garage. Marcus called to give me the address and phone number, but the invitation to visit was notably absent. 3 months passed before I heard from Marcus again. When he finally called, it was to invite me for dinner at their new home. I was thrilled, thinking maybe the honeymoon period was over, and he was ready to include his mother in his new life. I bought wine and flowers, got my hair done, and drove the 45 minutes to their neighborhood with genuine excitement. The house was even more impressive than Marcus had described. The driveway was circular, lined with perfectly manicured hedges and seasonal flowers. Stephanie answered the door wearing casual clothes that probably cost more than my monthly salary, and she greeted me with the same polite but distant smile I'd grown accustomed to. Dinner was served in their formal dining room at a table that could have seated 12 people. I complimented the beautiful place settings and fresh flowers, trying to make conversation while we ate. Stephanie mentioned that she'd hired an interior decorator and was considering redoing the guest bathrooms. Marcus talked about a promotion he was hoping for and a business trip to New York City. When I asked if they were planning to have children soon, Stephanie's expression tightened slightly. She said they were focused on their careers right now and weren't ready for that kind of responsibility. Marcus quickly agreed, adding that they wanted to establish themselves financially first. I nodded understanding, but couldn't help thinking about how I'd managed to raise him without any financial security at all. As the evening progressed, I began to feel increasingly out of place. Their conversation revolved around people and experiences I couldn't relate to, and my attempts to contribute felt clumsy and unwelcome. When I mentioned a funny story about Marcus as a child, Stephanie laughed politely but changed the subject immediately. It was as if my son's entire history before college had been erased. That night, as I was leaving, I overheard Stephanie talking to Marcus in their kitchen. She didn't know I'd come back for my purse, and her voice carried clearly through the open doorway. "Honey, I don't understand why your mother has to come to these family gatherings. She just doesn't fit with our social circle." Marcus's response was quiet, but I heard enough to break my heart. "I know, sweetheart. Let me handle it. I'll figure something out." I drove home that night knowing that my relationship with my son had fundamentally changed. The boy I'd raised to be kind and respectful had grown into a man who was ashamed of his origins. Somewhere along the way, Stephanie's values had become his values, and there was no place in that world for a woman who cleaned buildings and worked at a grocery store. For the next 2 years, my relationship with Marcus became increasingly distant and formal. Holiday visits became brief obligatory appearances. Birthday cards arrived in the mail instead of phone calls, and dinner invitations stopped completely. When I did see him, usually at some family function, he was polite but detached, treating me more like an acquaintance than the woman who'd raised him. But it was the invitation to his 30th birthday party that finally shattered any illusions I had left about my place in my son's life. The invitation arrived 3 weeks before the event, printed on expensive cardstock with elegant calligraphy. It was addressed to Mrs. Elnora Patterson in the same formal style used for all the other guests, with no personal note or phone call to follow up. I spent days deciding what to wear and what gift to bring. Finally, I settled on a watch I'd seen him admire in a store window months earlier. It was expensive by my standards, costing nearly 2 weeks' salary, but I had it engraved with "To Marcus, with all my love, Mom," and the date. I wrapped it carefully and wrote a card explaining how proud I was of the man he'd become, even though our relationship had grown complicated. The day of the party, I drove to their neighborhood feeling nervous but hopeful. Maybe this was Marcus's way of trying to bridge the gap between his old life and new one. Maybe he'd realized that success meant nothing without family to share it with. As I pulled into their driveway, I could see the party was already in full swing, with catering trucks and elegantly dressed guests visible through the large windows. I walked through the front door carrying my carefully wrapped gift and immediately felt underdressed despite wearing my nicest outfit. The party was clearly a sophisticated affair, with hired bartenders serving cocktails and servers passing elaborate appetizers. Stephanie was wearing a dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and Marcus looked handsome in an expensive suit as he worked the room like the successful businessman he'd become. A young woman with a clipboard approached me and asked for my name. When I told her, she consulted her list and then pointed toward the back corner of the room. "Your seat is right over there, Mrs. Patterson. Table 6. I thanked her and made my way through the crowd, nodding politely at the other guests, who were clearly Stephanie's family friends and Marcus's business associates. When I reached table 6, I stopped in shock. There, placed precisely at what was obviously meant to be my chair, was a small nameplate identical to the ones at every other seat. But while the other nameplates simply had guests' names written in elegant script, mine read, "Elnora, Trash," in the same beautiful calligraphy. I stared at the nameplate for several seconds, certain there had to be some mistake. I looked around to see if anyone else had noticed, but the other guests were engaged in conversations and seemed oblivious to my situation. I picked up the nameplate to examine it more closely, hoping it was some kind of joke or error that could be easily corrected. "Excuse me," I said to a passing server. "There seems to be a mistake with my nameplate. Could you please check with whoever is in charge of the seating arrangements? The young man looked at the nameplate and then consulted a master list from his pocket. I'm sorry, ma'am, but this is exactly what was ordered. Mr. Marcus specifically requested this nameplate for this seat. If you'd like me to check with him directly. He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. By now, several nearby guests had noticed our conversation and were looking curiously at the nameplate in my hands. I heard someone whisper, "Did that say trash?" followed by barely suppressed laughter. My face burned with embarrassment and confusion as I realized this wasn't a mistake at all. My own son had deliberately labeled me as garbage at his birthday celebration. Stephanie appeared beside me with a concerned expression that I now recognized as completely artificial. Oh my goodness, Elnora, there must be some sort of mix-up with the catering company. How embarrassing. Please just sit down and I'll have someone fix this right away. But her eyes told a different story. There was satisfaction there, barely hidden behind her mask of false sympathy. I looked across the room and saw Marcus watching the entire scene unfold. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I waited for him to come over and explain, to apologize, to show some sign that this humiliation wasn't intentional. Instead, he simply looked away and continued his conversation with a group of men in expensive suits. With as much dignity as I could muster, I sat down in the chair marked for trash and placed the nameplate face down in front of me. Around me, conversations resumed, but I could feel eyes watching and hear whispered comments about the woman who'd been labeled garbage at her own son's birthday party. I sat through the entire event without speaking to anyone, without eating anything, and without receiving so much as an acknowledgement from the guest of honor. When Marcus gave his speech, thanking all the important people in his life for their support and friendship, his eyes swept over me as if I were invisible. He talked about his beautiful wife, her wonderful family, his mentors at work, and his bright future ahead. Never once did he mention the woman who'd worked 3 jobs to pay for his education, who'd sacrificed her health and happiness so he could have opportunities she'd never dreamed of. I left the party without saying goodbye to anyone, walking out into the night air, feeling more alone than I'd felt since Robert died. The 45-minute drive home passed in a blur of tears and disbelief. How had the sweet boy who used to help me count change for groceries become a man who could publicly humiliate his own mother? When had success become more important to him than basic human decency? Back home in my small kitchen, I sat at the same table where Marcus had done his homework all those years ago. I stared at the wrapped gift I'd brought, but never given him, the expensive watch with its loving inscription now seeming like a cruel joke. I thought about returning it, but knew I'd never be able to explain the situation without dying of embarrassment. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt completely hopeless about the future. I'd spent 22 years working myself into the ground to give my child opportunities, and this was how he repaid me. Not with gratitude or respect, but with public humiliation and shame. I wondered if other mothers had raised children who grew up to be ashamed of their origins, or if I was uniquely cursed. But as the night wore on and my tears finally stopped, something else began to grow inside me. It started as a tiny spark of anger, barely noticeable at first, but it quickly grew into something much more powerful. I was angry at Marcus for his cruelty, angry at Stephanie for her influence, but mostly angry at myself for allowing this treatment to continue for so long. I walked to my bedroom closet and pulled out a metal filing box I'd kept hidden behind my winter coats for years. Inside were documents I'd hoped never to need, papers that represented the one secret I'd kept from Marcus his entire adult life. As I spread the contents across my bed, I began to form a plan that would teach my son the true value of the woman he'd labeled as trash. The most important document was a deed to the property where Marcus and Stephanie currently lived. What my son didn't know was that I was the actual legal owner of that land. Years ago, when he was still a minor, I'd purchased the property with money from Robert's life insurance policy and put it in Marcus's name for tax purposes and future planning. But since he'd been underage at the time, the transfer had never been legally completed. When Stephanie's family had sold the house to the young couple as a wedding gift, they'd actually purchased it from someone who didn't have the legal right to sell it. Marcus had signed papers transferring property he'd never actually owned. In the eyes of the law, I was still the rightful owner of their beautiful home and the land it sat on. There was more. The life insurance money had been substantial, and I'd invested most of it conservatively over the years while living on my job income. Between wise investments and 20 years of compound interest, I was sitting on assets worth more than Marcus made in 3 years at his prestigious job. I'd kept this information secret, planning to use it to secure both our futures when I got too old to work. I'd also been quietly contributing to several charitable organizations over the years, particularly one that helped single mothers get job training and educational opportunities. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd been helping other women improve their situations while allowing my own son to treat me like garbage. The next morning, I called in sick to all 3 of my jobs for the first time in years. Instead of going to work, I drove downtown to meet with Robert's old lawyer, a man named Henry Henderson, who'd helped me navigate the legal complexities after my husband's death. When I explained the situation, his face grew increasingly serious. "Elnora, you understand what you're asking me to do here. If you pursue this legal action, your son and his wife will lose their home. There could be significant financial consequences for them, especially if they've been making improvements or modifications to the property." I looked at Henry steadily and said, "My son labeled me as trash at his own birthday party in front of 50 people. He spent the last 2 years treating me like an embarrassment to his new life. Maybe it's time he learned where his new life actually came from." Henry nodded slowly and began pulling files from his cabinet. "It'll take a few days to prepare the paperwork, but you're absolutely within your rights here. The property transfer was never legally completed, and the subsequent sale was invalid. You want me to proceed with eviction proceedings." "Not eviction," I corrected. "I want to offer them a choice. Marcus can acknowledge publicly what he did to me and work to make amends, or he can find somewhere else to live. Either way, he's going to learn that actions have consequences even when you think you're too successful to worry about them." 3 days after Marcus's birthday party, he received a registered letter from Henderson's law firm. I can only imagine his shock as he read the legal documents explaining that he was living in a house he didn't own on land that belonged to the mother he'd labeled as trash. The letter gave him 72 hours to contact the law office to discuss resolution options before formal eviction proceedings would begin. My phone rang 6 hours later. For the first time in over 2 years, Marcus's voice on the other end sounded like the little boy I remembered. Mom, I need to talk to you. There's been some kind of mistake with these legal papers. Can I come over tonight, please?" "There's no mistake, Marcus," I said calmly. "And you can come over whenever you'd like. After all, this is still my house too. I've been living here for 24 years, ever since your father died, and left me to raise you alone." He arrived within an hour, still wearing his work clothes, but looking disheveled and panicked. Stephanie was with him, her usual composed demeanor completely shattered. They both started talking at once, asking questions and making demands, but I held up my hand for silence. "Sit down," I said, gesturing to the same kitchen table where Marcus had eaten thousands of meals I'd prepared for him. "I have some things to explain, and you're going to listen without interrupting." For the next hour, I laid out the truth about our family's financial situation. I explained how Robert's life insurance had provided the money to buy their land, how I'd saved and invested over the years, while working multiple jobs, how I'd quietly built a substantial nest egg that I'd planned to use for both our securities. But more importantly, I continued looking directly at Marcus. I want you to understand what you did to me at your party. You labeled me as trash in front of your friends and colleagues. You allowed people to laugh at the woman who sacrificed her health, her social life, and her happiness so you could have opportunities I never dreamed of. Marcus's face had gone pale as I spoke. Mom, I never meant for you to see that nameplate. It was supposed to be a joke, something that would get changed before you arrived. Stephanie thought it would be funny if... Don't blame your wife, I interrupted. You're 30 years old, Marcus. You made the choice to humiliate your mother publicly. You've made the choice to be ashamed of me for 2 years. Now you get to make another choice. I slid a document across the table to him. This is a list of conditions. If you agree to meet them, I'll transfer the property to you legally and properly. If you don't, you have 30 days to find somewhere else to live. The conditions were simple but non-negotiable. First, Marcus had to write a public apology letter explaining what he'd done and acknowledging the sacrifices I'd made for his success. The letter would be published in the local newspaper and posted on his social media accounts. Second, he had to volunteer for 1 year at the single mothers organization I supported, helping other women in situations similar to what I'd faced after Robert died. Finally, he had to attend family counseling with me for 6 months to address the fundamental issues in our relationship. If he completed all these requirements and showed genuine change in his attitude and behavior, I would transfer the property to him and continue our relationship as mother and son. If he refused or failed to follow through, I would sell the property and donate the proceeds to charity. Stephanie immediately objected, saying the public apology would be humiliating and could damage Marcus's professional reputation. Exactly, I replied. Now you understand how I felt at your party. Marcus sat in silence for several minutes, reading and rereading the document. Finally, he looked up at me with tears in his eyes. Mom, I'm so sorry. I don't know how I became someone who could treat you that way. I got caught up in trying to fit into Stephanie's world and forgot about the woman who made it possible for me to be there. Words are easy, Marcus, I said gently. What matters now is whether you're willing to back them up with actions. He signed the agreement that night. The public apology was published 2 weeks later, generating significant attention and mixed reactions from his social circle. Some of his colleagues respected him for taking responsibility for his mistakes, while others questioned his judgment. Stephanie was mortified by the publicity, but gradually came to understand why it had been necessary. Marcus threw himself into his volunteer work with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including me. He helped single mothers navigate college applications, taught financial planning workshops, and used his business connections to create job opportunities for women trying to rebuild their lives. For the first time since college, he seemed genuinely passionate about something beyond his own success. The family counseling sessions were difficult but productive. We talked about how success had changed Marcus's values, how he'd allowed external pressures to override his fundamental sense of right and wrong. We discussed the shame he'd felt about his humble origins and how that shame had poisoned his relationship with me. Slowly, gradually, my son began to emerge from the shell of the man he'd become. He started visiting regularly again, asking about my work and my life rather than just updating me on his achievements. He met some of my friends from the grocery store and seemed genuinely interested in their stories and struggles. 6 months after that terrible birthday party, Marcus completed all the requirements I'd set for him. But more importantly, he'd rediscovered the values I'd tried to instill in him as a child. The property transfer was finalized, but our relationship had been transformed into something stronger and more honest than it had ever been before. I used a portion of my investments to retire from all 3 of my jobs and open a resource center for working mothers in our community. Marcus and Stephanie both volunteered there regularly, and their marriage seemed stronger for having weathered the crisis together. Stephanie had learned some valuable lessons about respecting people regardless of their economic status, and she gradually became the daughter-in-law I'd always hoped for. The center provided job training, childcare assistance, and financial planning help for women trying to build better lives for their families. I thought about all the nights I'd worked until my hands bled, all the dreams I'd deferred, all the sacrifices I'd made. Now those experiences were helping other women navigate similar challenges, and my pain had been transformed into purpose. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that sometimes the people we love most need to face real consequences before they can change. Marcus had to lose everything he'd taken for granted to understand its true value. He had to see me as powerful rather than powerless before he could respect me as an equal rather than dismiss me as an embarrassment. The most important lesson wasn't about property ownership or financial security. It was about standing up for yourself when people treat you badly, even when those people are your own family. Love doesn't mean accepting disrespect, and sacrifice doesn't obligate you to tolerate cruelty. Sometimes in life, you have to be willing to lose everything in order to save what really matters. I was prepared to lose my relationship with my son to preserve my dignity and self-worth. Fortunately, the shock of potential loss helped Marcus remember who he really was underneath all the superficial success. Today, when I look at my son, I see the kind and respectful young man I raised, rather than the cruel stranger he'd become. Our relationship is built on mutual respect now, rather than his embarrassment and my desperation for acceptance. And when people ask me about overcoming difficult family situations, I tell them that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst behavior. The nameplate that once labeled me as trash now sits in my desk drawer as a reminder of how far we've both come. It reminds me that our worth isn't determined by other people's opinions, even when those people are supposed to love us unconditionally. We teach people how to treat us, and I'd spent too many years teaching my son that his mother's feelings didn't matter. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice between preserving a relationship and preserving your self-respect? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Please hit that like button if this story resonated with you, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming family challenges. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that they deserve better treatment from the people they love. Thank you for listening to my story and for reminding me that even in our darkest moments, we have the power to change our circumstances. Remember that your worth doesn't depend on anyone else's approval, not even your own children's. Sometimes, the greatest gift we can give someone is the opportunity to become a better person, even when it costs us everything. May you always have the courage to stand up for yourself and the wisdom to know when tough love is the most loving choice of all. Until next time, take care of yourselves and remember that you matter more than you know.